So, hello everyone, and welcome back. My name is Anna Greer again. I'm hosting the NeuroCalm Fatigue Summit, and I'm absolutely delighted to have with me today Ari Whitten, a man to whom I owe a lot of my own recovery. Ari set up something wonderful called the Energy Blueprint Program, which is multidimensional, science-led, incredibly rich program. He himself has overcome fatigue and spends, I know, a lot of his time researching cutting edge health optimization science. So it's an absolute privilege to have him here. He also has a wonderful podcast called the Energy Blueprint Podcast, where you get a free education, and I mean an education in cutting edge science and health optimization. So, Ari, it's absolutely amazing to have you here. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me, Anna. It's an absolute pleasure, and I've enjoyed our communication over the years and watching how much you've grown and recovered during this time. Of course, having your setbacks, as we all do, and helping you through those setbacks, and now seeing where you've come, and now arriving at a place where you want to help others with fatigue. It's been beautiful to watch, and I cherish our friendship.
Yeah, me too, Ari. It means a lot. So you take a very multi-dimensional approach. I think of all the people I've interviewed so far, yours is the most multi-layered. And I just wonder if you could really reflect briefly to the audience on why you think that multi-layered approach is so important for addressing fatigue.
Well, the short version of that answer, there's a really long version and a really short version. So the short version of that answer is there's a lot of dimensions. There's a lot of factors that contribute to why people have fatigue. And so anytime someone is only looking at one dimension, one factor, as one therapeutic approach to recovery, you are necessarily going to be limited in the effects that you can get. Now, what you'll typically have is, maybe I'll go on a little bit of a tangent here. Let's say you give people a placebo. You will get a segment of people that are healed from whatever their affliction is from a placebo. Let's say that prior to this podcast, we were talking about different psychotherapeutic approaches, everything from CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, to Rogerian therapy, where you're mirroring back to the patient what they're saying and basically attentively, lovingly listening, to EMDR, to NLP type, interventions, to psychodynamic, psychoanalytic approaches that take years or decades. And all of these approaches will have a segment of people that say, oh my gosh, this is amazing, it's incredible, it completely transformed my life. And it will also have a whole much larger segment, most likely, of people saying, I didn't really get much benefit, or it got me a little bit, it did a little bit of benefit to me, but not that much. And every individual therapy tends to be like that. And sometimes you really hit the mark, where you have a certain individual who the entirety of their problem is this one thing. Let's say, as an example, a few weeks ago, I met a woman from the UK who there was some kind of famous incident when she was a child in her town where there was lead poisoning. And everybody in this whole town, or this whole small city, got lead poisoning. And it happened to her when she was like 9 or 11 years old, and she's had symptoms ever since for decades. You can have a singular cause like that that's very crystallized. It's this one thing, and ever since this one thing happened to me, this one terrible, horrible thing, I've had all these problems. And in a case like that, maybe one therapeutic intervention, like targeted as detoxification in this case, like heavy metal chelation and getting that lead out of that person's body, might be the single therapy that is needed in that case. But by and large, the vast majority of people suffering from fatigue, it's not just one thing. It's a combination of many different causes that are either causing the energy production systems, and we can get into how this works if you want. I'll give the short version here, but causing the energy production systems of our body to either intentionally shut down energy production. So they're restraining themselves from producing a lot of energy, or you're damaging the energy systems so they can't produce as much energy, or factors that cause atrophy of those energy systems, such that, just as a large muscle can lift a heavy weight and one that's atrophied and weakened can't lift that weight, the same is true internally with our cellular energy production systems. If those energy production systems atrophy and we lose the capacity to produce energy, it's like going from a big Ferrari engine in our cells to a moped engine in our cells. If you have a moped engine in your cells, it doesn't matter how much heavy metal chelation you do or how much supplements you take or whatever other therapy you do, you still have a moped engine in your cells and you still have very low capacity to produce energy. So we have lots and lots of factors, which I'm happy to talk about, that interact with the human energy system in those three different ways. And so when we look at the environmental factors and the lifestyle factors, there's a sizable list. Yeah. Depending on how you lump them together, 7 or 10 or 15 different key factors that are doing at least one, if not multiple, of those three things that I just mentioned to either damage or shut down or cause atrophy in our energy production systems.
So, Ari, what I'm getting from this is the complexity of the body itself as this amazing system of systems, and how easily it is affected by complex factors in the environment. And there's a kind of intimacy, isn't there? There's a kind of flow between those things. Now, one of the themes that comes up for me when I listen to your work quite often is the fundamental mismatch between the evolutionary intelligence of the body and the way that we live in contemporary society. And I would love you to talk about that, about what fatigue indicates at this particular point in the 21st century, about that mismatch.
Yeah, great question. So, and thank you for asking that, because that, honestly, that's the most important question, and one that I think gets lost as you talk to a lot of the more cutting edge practitioners, right? There's people working with different demographics, and there's people who have different paradigms and ways of thinking and systems of thinking and therapeutic approaches that they're mired in. And so we need to understand what level of thinking we're dealing with, and not to say that one is necessarily superior than the other. Some are superior to others, but some have their place in the hierarchy, and others have a different place, and they're both needed. So here's what I mean by that. I was having a conversation a few days ago with a practitioner who has worked for decades with patients with chronic complex illness, chronic fatigue syndrome, chronic infections, Lyme disease, very complex illness that nobody knows how to even diagnose. It's just weird symptoms that people have had for decades that are debilitating, that no one can figure out. And this doctor is a brilliant doctor, and he's been working with that demographic for a long time. And he has a very deep understanding of all of this very complex biochemistry and all kinds of very advanced cutting edge approaches to trying to address these specific biochemical abnormalities that are common in this demographic of people. And how do we use these therapies to try to reverse these diseases, whether we're trying to get mold toxins out or heavy metals out or do whatever else, And it's important to understand that all of that kind of thinking, needed as and important as it is to help that demographic of people, is a totally different kind of thinking from what I'm engaged in, right? Like I don't know a lot about how to help that demographic of people in that context where we're going to run $50,000 of lab tests and identify a million different biochemical abnormalities, and then what specific drugs or supplements or therapies we're going to engage in to try to correct those specific things that show up on that test. What I'm engaged in is based on a simple set of observations. Chronic fatigue and chronic fatigue syndrome doesn't exist in traditional living human populations and hunter-gatherer populations. And we don't need to invoke anything about people that lived many thousands of years ago. There are hunter-gatherer populations that exist in the world today, in Africa and the South Pacific, in the South America, and these populations are pretty well studied at this point. We know a lot about how they eat, how they live, prevalence of different diseases, body composition, metabolic health. We know a lot. And chronic fatigue doesn't exist there. Insomnia doesn't exist there. Depression kind of occasionally exists there. People get sad, but it doesn't exist in the way that it exists for us. Anxiety is not a thing like it is for us. More importantly, all the diseases of metabolic health, which are the major killers in Western society. So diabetes and obesity, heart disease, neurological disease, most of these things either don't exist at all or have such a low prevalence that they're insignificant. They arise so late in life that it's not significant. So that's the starting point. We need to ask, why don't these diseases exist in those populations? And the answer is pretty straightforward. It's because the modern Western lifestyle of modernized, developed countries is fundamentally a lifestyle, a diet, and an environment that is mismatched to what our biology is designed for. And that is the origin of all of these diseases of metabolic health, including chronic fatigue. Chronic fatigue is one of many different conditions that arises largely from the same group of factors that drive poor metabolic and poor mitochondrial health. Mitochondria are our cellular energy generators that I was alluding to before. They're very central not only to energy production, but to our resilience to stressors, to the rate of aging itself, to our ability to be resistant to the damaging stressors of modern life. And when we have robust mitochondrial health and robust metabolic health, we can be resilient to all kinds of stressors. But when that deteriorates, and now we have multiple factors, multiple new sources of stress in our life, combined with a lack of the certain type of hormetic stressors that we are designed to have in our life that create robust health and strength and resilience in our internal metabolic workings, in our mitochondria. The combination of the modern world filled with lots of stress combined with weak internal cellular health and mitochondrial health creates a situation where our body is basically overwhelmed by the stressors of the modern world, and hence we get all kinds of different diseases. And that's why we have many, many different diseases. We have epidemics of diseases that don't even exist in human populations that are living in a more natural way.
So that's a huge picture. And I imagine that quite a lot of people might feel a kind of information action ratio around that, because what do we do in the modern contemporary West? We're bombarded by toxins and all the rest of it. And our lifestyle is counter healthy, it's anti-health. So individual sufferers from fatigue, where should they start? What can they do, especially, Ari, if they haven't got much financial resource, which many people with fatigue actually don't have for obvious reasons after a while, much financial resource? Where do they start?
Yeah. Well, the good news is most hunter-gatherers are pretty poor.
That's true. That's true.
And so they're engaging in lots of things that don't involve lots of expensive gadgets. And in fact, this is a bit counterintuitive, but it's to a large extent, a lot of the modern conveniences and luxuries are the very things that are driving modern disease epidemics. So I can give a few specific examples. I'm talking so much in the abstract here. I'll maybe make it a bit more concrete. So one example is we are meant to have movement integrated into our life. Okay, well, now we have refrigerators So we don't have to be walking and running and hunting and for hours every day, moving around to gather food or hunt food to acquire our daily food for the day, or farm food even in the post-agricultural era. There's still a lot of movement involved to herd the flocks and tend to the fields and sort of that sort of thing. Now we can sit on our butts all day long and consume food. And so there is a fundamental mismatch between the amount of movement we have each day, the amount of energy expenditure, energy production that's needed at the cellular level to make our bodies move, and the energy intake. And that is one source of metabolic stress and poor metabolic health as a result of that. Your body will weaken and atrophy. You'll get insulin resistance. You'll get mitochondrial atrophy as a result of that modern variable. Another one is we're surrounded by artificial light instead of just being lit by the sun and the moon and the stars and firelight. And as soon as we moved indoors and created artificial light, and now we also have screens, and now we also have very unnatural lighting in most of our homes because it's energy efficient, like LEDs and fluorescents, we surrounded ourselves with a huge variable that massively influences our circadian rhythm in our brain, which in turn regulates our 24-hour sleep and wake cycles, massively influences your sleep quality and your energy levels during the day and your mood during the day. It interacts with numerous different neurotransmitters that drive mood and motivation and energy and wakefulness and sleep and relaxation, and many different hormones like thyroid hormone and cortisol and melatonin and growth hormone and insulin and testosterone are all linked to the circadian rhythm. There's an expression that I heard recently that I really like. This guy said that if you have an orchestra but no conductor, you have noise. If you have an orchestra with a conductor, you have music. Well, this circadian clock in our brain is like a conductor for all these different neurotransmitters and all these rhythms of these different hormones, and they're meant to be yoked to one another. And if you don't have the proper inputs to that circadian rhythm, now you have widespread hormonal dysregulation in all these different very important hormones that have basically interactions with every cell in your body. So you have hormonal noise, hormonal chaos, basically. And as long as you don't have the proper light inputs entering your eyes and feeding back into the circadian clock in your brain. So the modern world is full of these kinds of mismatches with our biology. There's many more I could go on to. Of course, nutrition is a massive one. The modern food supply does not resemble what humans should be eating. The modern world is filled with lots of environmental toxicants. We're also sitting in comfortable climate-controlled environments where we're protected from the heat and the cold, which are crucially important hormetic stressors that stimulate our mitochondria, keep them robust and big and strong. And so all of these kinds of mismatches are ultimately what, again, going back to what I said in the first question, either directly damage our mitochondria, our cellular energy generators, cause them to shut down, so they're deciding to produce less energy, or cause atrophy and shrinkage of their system, so it literally shrinks our cellular engine. So those mismatches are the fundamental things that are driving the problem in the first place. And, kind of going back to what I said at the beginning of my response here, in contrast to somebody who's working on all kinds of cutting edge therapies to reverse complex illness, what I'm doing is I'm actually looking through a lens of what are the factors, the key factors that are driving this chronic illness in the first place, these disease epidemics, and let's reverse it there. Now, the weakness of my view is that in cases where somebody has multi-decades long severe chronic illness, it's not enough, and they will need more targeted interventions to address their specific biochemical abnormalities. And the harsh truth is not everybody is going to recover. Some, the doctor I spoke to a few days ago, who's been working for decades with people with chronic complex illness, he said, here's how you know somebody's full of shit if they work with patients with chronic complex illness. If they tell you that they have a 90 or 100% success rate.
Mm.
Because the harsh truth is many of those cases are very difficult to solve, and not everybody gets better. Sometimes people with these kinds of illnesses stay ill for the rest of their life and they die ill.
Yeah.
Now, I don't mean to not inspire hope here. I do think the vast majority of people can get better, but I just want to position my approach in the landscape of this bigger picture. And I will also say, on a final note, over 80% of the chronic disease burden in the West are diseases of lifestyle. Over 80% are directly attributable to the factors that I just mentioned, that are this mismatch between what our biology is designed for in the modern world, how we're living differently from our ancestors. Over 80% of the chronic disease burden is directly from that. So I say, let's address that.
Yeah. So if you had a decisive influence on public policy, Ari, what would you want to do in terms of education and in terms of intervention?
You know, there are two countries in the world where they allow direct advertising from pharmaceutical companies to the general population. The United States and New Zealand. I don't know why it's only those two countries. Well, I know why the United States. I don't know why New Zealand. I mean, I might suspect the UK also to be in there, but apparently it isn't.
Yet.
Yes, that's a good addition to that sentence. Our health institutions are hopelessly lost, and I think the last few years has shown that very clearly to anybody who is scientifically literate and is paying attention. The pharmaceutical industry has massively corrupted the regulatory bodies that are in charge of regulating the safety and efficacy of medicines and therapeutics that are being approved. And it has massively corrupted the media as well as politicians. I mean, in the United States, I don't know how it is in every other country's government, but we have this insane system that everybody has accepted as normal, where private corporations can literally just pay politicians.
Yeah.
And, you know, they can't directly say, hey, I'm giving you this money so you vote on this bill in this direction. But it's implied, if you want to keep receiving $100,000, $200,000, $500,000 from our drug company every year, we would really like you to vote on policies that are to our benefit. And of course, people are very self-interested and interested in, at least some people are, receiving that amount of money and are content to do that. Sometimes out of ignorance, sometimes out of who knows what. But and all of this is real. I don't mean to sound like a conspiracy theorist. This is all, nothing I'm saying is even controversial. This is all out in the open. And I mean, I can get into controversial territory, but everything I just said is perfectly fact checkable with a few Google searches. And
it is, and it especially affects a population with chronic fatigue and other illnesses, because they're so desperate for help, so desperate for recovery, that you know, they're often offered drugs that are actually counterproductive, because the drugs, you know, we know can really mess up mitochondrial function and all the rest of it. So it seems to me that those of us with fatigue who are getting educated about the fundamental biological mismatch between contemporary life and those patterns and our bodily health are, in a sense, a little resistance movement.
yes.
Because that's the point of agency, isn't it? It's understanding this and doing what you can where you are. And even very bedbound people can start with breath work, for example. Even if they can't move, they can start using breath work to try and strengthen their mitochondrial well-being and things like that. But it seems to me that
Sorry, you want
I
to
was going to
complete
say,
your
it
thought?
seems to me that this is a pivotal question for this particular population, Ari, what you're saying, because it's this population that often gets bombed with information and bombed with interventions that are actually deeply counterproductive and damaging.
Yes, I agree with you 100%. And I'll say, to kind of connect the dots on some of the things that I was just saying there, I grew up in a climate where the attitude is we are searching for a cure for this disease and that disease. And of course, what that always means is pharmaceutical companies are searching for a drug that will cure blank disease. Do you know how many drugs we have cures for, or how many diseases we have drug cures for? Out of all the diseases and all of the hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars that have been poured into all these pharmaceutical companies for decades and decades and decades, it's something like 3% of
Whoa,
diseases.
whoa.
3%. Okay. Um,
Oh,
and
that's
then
shocking.
if you remove infections and antibiotics from that statistic, it's like less than 1%.
Yeah.
Okay, because most of the cures are actually infections, and we have this drug that is a cure for this bacterial or fungal infection.
Mm.
Okay, and so if you remove those, there are almost zero drug cures for any chronic disease. And yet, the whole paradigm that the entire medical establishment is operating in is let's go find drug cures for these different diseases. The way that the general public is indoctrinated since they're little kids, especially people in the United States, where they grow up in one of these few countries where you have direct pharma to the population advertising, is you grow up thinking, when I grow up, whatever disease I have, they will have a drug cure for by the time I get that disease. Well, here's what's interesting. You can go back to the 1940s or 1950s and find articles in newspapers saying, we're on the verge of a cure for cancer. 1940s, 1950s, I'm talking 80 years ago, they were saying those things, the same things that they're saying now,
Mm. And
right?
isn't it true that the third highest cause of death in the world is side effects from medical procedures and drugs?
Yeah, iatrogenic, yes.
Yeah.
So, and
You put those two things together and it's highly disturbing information, especially for
exactly.
those chronically ill, because as you say, the paradigm is so mismatched. I mean, if I break my leg, of course I want a doctor, and it might be that if I have a cancer and I've got a tumor, I might need it cutting out or whatever, depending what kind of cancer it is and what the research shows. But for a chronic condition, going back to basic bodily intelligence, basic biological realities, like the way you do, Ari, is utterly empowering, because I am the point of agency. I decide what I eat. I decide when I get up. I decide what light exposure I get. I decide whether I do heat work and cold exposure. It's actually what you're saying is really, really empowering and liberatory for people with chronic conditions.
Yes, absolutely. And if I was going to change public policy to some degree, it's pretty straightforward. We have over 80% of this chronic disease burden is from nutrition and lifestyle factors. Maybe we should make that central to addressing the chronic disease burden, instead of something that doctors literally receive zero education in, right? That's how corrupt the whole and how backwards the whole institution is. We're educating doctors to receive no education whatsoever in any of the factors that drive over 80% of the chronic disease burden.
Mm.
It's hard to overstate the absurdity of something that is operating in that way. So yes, we can take control of our health and our life, and it has to be something that we do ourselves. It's not something you can rely on the government to do for you, and the institutions around you to look after you and take care of you and find cures for you. The harsh reality is whatever disease you get, more than likely they will not have a cure for it. And the best way to deal with that is to prevent that disease. And the good news is over 80% of the diseases that people get are pretty easy to prevent, and we know how to prevent them. And so but it is difficult in the sense that we live in a world that is obesogenic, that drives poor metabolic health and drives excess body fat gain, which is central to a lot of the metabolic health issues that drive disease. That we live in an environment and lifestyle that is by default, the norm of how people live drives mitochondrial atrophy. We're surrounded by over 70,000 man-made toxins. We know that from tests with newborn babies, when they test umbilical cord blood, there are several hundred man-made toxins that are detectable in the umbilical cord blood. So before a human is even born into the world, they already have exposure to all kinds of hormonal disrupting chemicals, neurotoxic chemicals, mitochondrial toxic chemicals. We're fighting an uphill battle in that sense, just based on the world we live in. And the only intelligent response, and the only one that will work to prevent and reverse most of this chronic disease burden, is to take charge of our own health and to cultivate our own lifestyle, our own microenvironment, our own way of life that is about cultivating health and allowing our biology to thrive and function optimally, instead of reverting to the default of how most people around us are living. Because the way that most people live drives disease.
This is wonderful, Ari, and we could talk for hours. I want to thank you so much for this conversation. I think this is a wonderful note to end it on, because actually we've really seen there the link between the state the planet's in and our human bodies and the susceptibility we have, and the power, the agency that we each have. And I would thoroughly want to thank you and recommend to everyone, if you don't know Ari's work, go out there, find the man and follow him and listen to his podcast if you can't get onto the program, because it is phenomenally good information. It's a massive wake-up call. Fatigue is a massive wake-up call to the world. And I think Ari's work really demonstrates the positive directions in which we can move as individuals with fatigue and what that means collectively as well. So Ari, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate the wide range of conversation. We got into a lot of areas that I don't normally get into, and I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Me too, Ari. Thank you.